The clatter of silver on porcelain was a language Nia understood. It spoke of satisfaction, of impatience, of wealth so profound it bred carelessness. She moved between the starched white tables of Latoile with an economy of motion that was its own form of grace, her red vest a slash of color in the sea of muted tones. Her face was a polite, professional mask, betraying none of the exhaustion that pulled at the muscles in her back and feet. It was a skill, this invisibility. She had perfected it over 2 years of serving men who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Tonight, the air was different. It was heavier, charged with the kind of pressure that precedes a storm. It all emanated from one table in the corner, a booth upholstered in dark leather that seemed to absorb the light. 4 men sat there, their suits so exquisitely tailored they looked like armor. 3 of them were loud, their laughter sharp and brittle. The 4th was silent. He sat at the head of the table, a man carved from stillness. His suit was the color of a midnight sky, his white shirt pristine. He didn't participate in the conversation, but he was its center, the gravitational point around which the others orbited. Nia had caught a glimpse of ink, a complex tapestry of black and gray, peeking from beneath his cuff as he lifted a glass of water. It was the only flaw in his perfect, severe presentation. His eyes, when they briefly swept the room, were dark and flat, missing nothing. Nia's station included their table. Her colleague, a seasoned waiter named Marcus, had paled when he realized who they were. "Just keep your head down," he'd whispered to her in the kitchen. "Refill their water, clear their plates, don't make eye contact." That one. He owns things you don't want to know about. Nia had no interest in knowing. She just wanted to get through her shift, collect her tips, and fall into bed. She approached the table, her water pitcher cool and heavy in her hand. The men were speaking Japanese, their words rapid and clipped. She'd spent 4 years of college majoring in East Asian studies, 2 of those years living in Kyoto. The language was as natural to her as English, a secret part of her she never used here. As she leaned in to refill a glass, one of the louder men, his face flushed with sake, gestured dismissively in her direction. "Look at this," he said in Japanese, his tone thick with condescension. "They hire anyone now. She probably can't even count the change correctly." His friend snickered. "Be careful. She might spill water on your $1,000 shoes." Nia's hand didn't tremble. Her expression didn't shift. She continued her task, moving from one glass to the next with practiced ease. But inside, a familiar, weary anger kindled. It was the casual dismissal, the assumption of her incompetence, that scraped her raw. She reached the last glass, the one belonging to the silent man. As she poured, she kept her eyes down, focused on the steady stream of water. When the glass was full, she straightened up. Instead of retreating, she held her position for a fraction of a second. In flawless, formal Japanese, her voice low and perfectly modulated, she said, "If the gentleman is concerned about his footwear, I can assure him my hands are quite steady. The bill will be calculated to the last cent. I hope you enjoy the rest of your meal." Silence. It was absolute. The air crackled. The 2 men who had spoken stared at her, their mouths slightly agape, twin masks of shock and humiliation. The 3rd man froze with a piece of tuna halfway to his lips. But Nia wasn't looking at them. Her gaze was drawn, against her will, to the silent man at the head of the table. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his eyes were on her now, really on her, not through her. It was like being pinned by a searchlight. There was no surprise in his expression, only a sudden, unnerving intensity. An assessment. It felt like he was peeling back her skin, looking at the mechanics of her bones and breath. That was the moment she made the mistake of truly looking back. His eyes were not just dark, they were deep, holding a cold, ancient stillness. He saw her, all of her, the competent waitress, the exhausted student, the woman who had just used her intellect as a quiet weapon. A slow, almost imperceptible nod was his only reaction. It wasn't for his men. It was for her. An acknowledgement. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had made herself visible, She gave a slight, professional bow and turned, walking away on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. The back of her neck prickled, the weight of his stare a physical touch. She made it to the kitchen, leaning against the cool steel of the prep counter, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Marcus looked at her, his eyes wide. "What did you do?" They all went dead quiet. "I just spoke to them," she whispered, her own voice sounding distant. Before she could explain further, her manager, Mr. Dubois, burst through the swinging doors, his face ashen.
"Nia."
"My office."
"Now."
The walk to his office felt like a mile. Mr. Dubois didn't ask her to sit. He paced behind his desk, wringing his hands. "What did you say to the gentleman at table 12? One of them made a rude comment. I responded. You responded? In what language? Japanese." He stopped pacing, his expression a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Do you have any idea who that is?" "That is Kaido Tanaka, the head of the Tanakagumi. People don't respond to him or his guests. They evaporate. They cease to exist." The name meant nothing to her, but the tone of utter terror in her manager's voice told her everything. Yakuza. The word screamed in her mind. Not just a rich businessman. A crime boss. "He wants to see you," Mr. Dubois said, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "He dismissed his guests. He's waiting." "I'm not going back out there," Nia said, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "You don't have a choice," he hissed. He asked for the waitress who spoke Japanese. And then he said something to my hostess. Something that made her start crying. The dread turned to ice. "What did he say?" Mr. Dubois swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. He stared at a point on the wall behind her. He said, "I want her." The words hung in the sterile air of the office, obscene and absolute. It wasn't a proposition. It was a declaration of ownership. A claim. "Fire me," Nia said, her voice shaking but firm. "Fire me right now. I'll leave out the back." "You think that will stop him?" Mr. Dubois laughed. A high, hysterical sound. He just bought the restaurant. Not in theory. He made a call. The money is being transferred. He owns this building, this kitchen, me, and right now you. He told me your employment is terminated. But your evening is not over. You're to collect your things and leave with him. The floor seemed to drop away. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. She was a student, a waitress. Her world was tuition payments and tired feet and the simple pleasure of a quiet apartment. It wasn't this.
It couldn't be this.
There was a soft knock on the office door. It opened to reveal one of Kaido's men, a younger man in a similar dark suit, his face impassive. He looked at Nia, then at Mr. Dubois. "The boss is ready to leave." The choice was an illusion. There was no choice. To refuse was not an option. Numbly, Nia walked to the staff locker room, her movements stiff and robotic. She changed out of her uniform, pulling on her jeans and a simple sweater. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to find a window, to scream for help. But the calm, blank face of the man waiting for her outside the locker room door told her how futile that would be. He escorted her through the now quiet dining room. The other patrons were gone. The staff was huddled in the kitchen, their faces pale with fear. Kaido was standing by the entrance, shrugging into a long, black overcoat. He didn't look at her as she approached. He simply held the door open. The cold night air was a shock to her system. A black sedan, so polished it looked like a pool of liquid darkness, was waiting at the curb. The driver stood holding the rear door open. Kaido's hand settled on the small of her back, a light but firm pressure that guided her toward the car. His touch was cool, even through the fabric of her sweater. It was not violent. It was worse. It was possessive. Inevitable. As she slid onto the buttery leather of the back seat, she looked back at the familiar lights of Latoile, the place that had been the predictable, mundane center of her life. It looked alien now, a scene from someone else's story. Kaido slid in beside her, and the door closed with a solid, final thud, sealing them in a world of tinted glass and absolute silence. Her life as she knew it had just ended. The next part, the terrifying, unknown part, had just begun. The car moved through the city with a silent, predatory grace. Nia stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into ribbons of light. She was hyper-aware of him beside her. The space between them felt charged, a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out.
He didn't speak.
He just sat there, his profile stark against the city lights, the very picture of calm, controlled power. The scent of his cologne filled the small space, something clean and sharp, like cedar and cold air. She ran through her options.
Scream.
The glass was probably soundproof. Jump out. The doors were undoubtedly locked. Fight him. That was laughable. He was a coiled spring of lethal potential. She was a waitress with a student loan. Her best weapon had always been her mind, but right now, it was blank with terror. The car eventually slipped into a private underground garage, descending several levels before stopping in a reserved area patrolled by men in dark suits. Kaido got out and waited for her, his patience a form of intimidation. She followed him into a private elevator. He pressed the button for the penthouse, the highest floor. The apartment was vast and minimalist, a symphony of glass, steel, and black marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering, godlike view of the entire city. It was beautiful and cold, a space designed for a man who observed the world from a great, untouchable height. He finally spoke, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cavernous room. Drink. She shook her head, unable to form words. He walked to a bar and poured himself a whiskey, the clink of the decanter against the glass the only sound. He turned, leaning against the bar, and watching her. That unnerving, analytical gaze was back. "You are not on the staff manifest for Latoil," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I use my mother's maiden name for work," she managed, her voice tight. For safety, a pathetic irony, given her current situation. "And your real name?" "Nia." He tasted the name, rolling it over his tongue silently. "Nia," he repeated, and the way he said it was different.
Softer.
It made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Where did you learn the language?" "I was a student. At a university in Kyoto. You speak it without an accent. Your cadence is perfect. That takes more than a classroom." "I was dedicated," she said, giving nothing away. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Dedication is a valuable quality.
So is discipline.
You displayed both tonight. You humiliated my associates without raising your voice or spilling a drop of water. That is a rare skill." This was a test. Every word, every question, was a step in a dance she didn't know the choreography for. "They were insulting," she said, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. "They were," he agreed, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "And they've been disciplined for it. But that is not why you are here." "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He set his glass down with a precise click. "Because in my world, assets are to be acquired. Liabilities are to be eliminated. Tonight, you demonstrated that you are a remarkable asset. Your intelligence, your composure, your fluency. These are tools. I have a use for such tools." The coldness of his words was more terrifying than any threat. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as an object, a resource to be exploited. Before she could respond, a phone on the counter buzzed, a harsh, insistent sound. Kaido answered it, his back to her. His entire posture changed. The calm observer vanished, replaced by a commander. He listened, his body going rigid. "Where?" he snapped. Another pause.
No.
"Hold position. I am on my way." He hung up and turned. The mask was gone. For the first time, she saw something raw and dangerous in his eyes. A controlled fury that promised violence. "There is a problem," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "A rival family, the Hashimoto clan, has made a move." A foolish 1 inch. He looked at her, and his gaze was complicated. "They target what you value. They find the person you cannot afford to lose, and they squeeze." The words echoed in the silent room. He was talking about his enemies, but he was also telling her something about himself. She saw a crack in the marble facade, a glimpse of a wound he carried. He was speaking of a past failure, A lesson learned in blood. She could feel it. He had lost someone. A woman. It was a certainty that settled deep in her bones. He had failed to protect someone before, and the shame of it had carved him into the man he was today. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Right now, nothing," he said, grabbing a set of keys from a bowl on the counter. "But you are with me. That may be enough to make you a target." He walked to a closet and pulled out a long, dark coat, tossing it to her. "Put this on. We are leaving." "Leaving? To where?" "A safer location." Suddenly, a deep, resonant boom shook the entire building. The glass walls vibrated, and a tremor ran through the marble floor beneath her feet. Car alarms began to shriek from far below. Nia stumbled, catching herself on a chair. Kaido was already moving, his earlier fury now a cold, lethal focus. "They are closer than I thought," he said, his voice devoid of any panic. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel. "The elevator is not an option. We take the stairs." He pulled her toward a service door she hadn't noticed. The danger was no longer an abstract concept. It was real. It was here. And the only thing between her and it was the very man who had stolen her from her life. In that moment, a strange, terrible clarity washed over her. Her survival was now inextricably linked to his. He moved through the concrete stairwell with a fluid, practiced urgency, pulling her along behind him. His body was a shield, always positioned between her and the direction of the threat. Down they went, floor after floor, the sound of their footsteps and her own ragged breathing echoing in the enclosed space. At the 10th floor landing, he suddenly stopped, pushing her flat against the wall and putting a finger to his lips. He'd heard something. Nia held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear it now, scuffling sounds from below, a muffled grunt. Kaido drew a handgun from the small of his back. The movement was so smooth, so natural, it was as if the weapon were an extension of his own body. The sight of it made her blood run cold. He was a killer. Not in theory. In practice. He gestured for her to stay put, his eyes hard and commanding. Then he was gone, melting around the corner of the stairwell like a shadow. She was alone, pressed against the cold concrete, every nerve screaming. She could run. Up or down.
Flee.
It was her chance. But her feet were rooted to the spot. A morbid, terrifying curiosity held her captive. That, and the chilling realization that she didn't know who was waiting for her on the other side of the door. Kaido was a monster, but he was a known monster. The ones hunting him were not. A choked cry echoed up the stairwell, followed by a sickening thud. Then, silence. A silence that was heavier, more final than before. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, Kaido reappeared. There was a dark slash of blood on his cheek, not his own. His expression was grim. He reholstered his weapon without a word and grabbed her hand, his palm warm and steady against her cold skin. "Come on." They exited on a lower floor, navigating a maze of service corridors. He seemed to know the building's layout intimately. They emerged into a different, less conspicuous garage. A simple black sedan was waiting, a man she hadn't seen before in the driver's seat. As they slipped out into the city streets, Kaido finally looked at her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the wide-eyed shock on her face. A flicker of something, regret, annoyance, crossed his features. He took a clean, folded handkerchief from his pocket and gently wiped the smudge of blood from his own cheek. Then, he reached over and touched her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was grounding, an anchor in the chaos. "Breathe, Nia," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. It was the first time he had shown her anything resembling tenderness, a small, almost deniable gesture of care in the midst of violence and fear. And it terrified her more than anything else that had happened tonight. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a part of the city that had no name, all gray concrete and anonymous windows. Inside, it was Spartan and clean, furnished with only the bare essentials. It smelled of dust and disuse. Kaido immediately went to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. He was a caged predator, coiled and tense. Nia sank onto the edge of a stiff sofa, her body finally succumbing to the adrenaline crash. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her bones. The events of the past few hours played on a loop in her mind. The quiet threat in the restaurant, the explosion, the sight of the gun, the blood on his face. She looked at him, really looked at him, as he stood silhouetted against the window. He was a purveyor of violence, a man who moved through a world of death and fear. And she had just followed him into it. She could have run in that stairwell. She should have run. But she hadn't. "You should have left me at the restaurant," she said, her voice thin. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "That was never an option. From the moment you spoke, you were part of the equation. Leaving you there would have made you a liability. The Hashimoto would have found you.
So, this is what you do.
You acquire assets by force." The anger was returning, pushing back the fear. "I do what is necessary for survival," he replied, his voice level. "My survival. And now yours." He winced, a sharp, involuntary movement, and brought a hand to his side. In the dim light, she saw a dark stain spreading across the fabric of his white shirt. He'd been injured. In the chaos, in the stairwell, he'd been hit. "You're bleeding," she said, stating the obvious. He glanced down as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It's a scratch." But as he moved, the scratch revealed itself to be a deep, vicious gash along his ribs, likely from a knife. Blood was seeping through his shirt at an alarming rate. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the wall. The marble man was mortal after all. "We have to call a doctor," Nia said, rising to her feet. "No doctors," he said through gritted teeth.
No hospitals.
"It brings unwanted attention." He pushed himself off the wall and went into the small bathroom, emerging a moment later with a cheap, plastic-wrapped first aid kit.
He tossed it onto the coffee table.
It contained little more than antiseptic wipes, gauze, and a small roll of tape. It was woefully inadequate. He pulled his ruined shirt off over his head, hissing in pain. The wound was worse than she'd thought. Long and deep, it was still weeping blood. The sight of it, stark against the canvas of his skin and the intricate art of his tattoos, should have repulsed her. Instead, a strange, unwelcome instinct took over. The pragmatic, competent part of her that knew how to solve a problem. "That needs stitches," she said, her voice steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a sharp focus. "I will manage," he said, fumbling with a gauze pad. "You're going to bleed out or get an infection," she countered, her tone sharp. She walked over to the table and picked up the kit. Inside, nestled beneath the bandages, was a sterile suture kit, a needle and thread. She had never stitched a person before, but she had watched hours of videos, had practiced on pig's feet for biology class, driven by a morbid curiosity. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. She looked at him. He was watching her, his dark eyes narrowed, assessing her again. This was another test. "Give me the antiseptic," she said. It was an order. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he sat on the edge of the sofa and nodded. It was a surrender, an act of trust that felt more significant than any words they had exchanged. She knelt before him. The act felt strangely intimate, almost like a prayer. The air was thick with the coppery smell of his blood and the clean scent of his skin. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. He didn't flinch, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the tight control he exerted over his own pain. Then she picked up the needle. "This is going to hurt," she whispered. "I am aware," he said, his voice a low rasp. She pushed the needle through his skin. He inhaled sharply but made no other sound. She worked in silence, her focus absolute, pulling the thread, closing the flesh, her movements becoming more confident with each stitch. She was no longer Nia the waitress. She was something else. Someone who could kneel in a dusty safe house and sew up a killer, her hands steady, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. This was the line. She was crossing it. With every stitch, she was binding herself to him, to this violent, dark world. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was an active participant, an accomplice. The thought should have horrified her. But all she felt was a strange, grim sense of purpose. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly. Her hands were smeared with his blood. She looked up at him. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear. They were fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You should have run in the stairwell," he said, his voice low. It was a statement, not a question. "I know," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Why didn't you?" She thought for a moment, the truth rising up, stark and undeniable. "I told myself it was survival," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "That you were the only way out. But I was lying to myself." The confession hung in the air between them. It was more intimate than a kiss, more dangerous than a declaration of love. It was an admission of a shared, dark gravity pulling them together. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "You are more of an asset than I ever could have imagined, Nia." A phone, a cheap burner phone he'd taken from a drawer, rang shrilly, shattering the moment. He answered. As he listened, his face hardened, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing like smoke. He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was a physical blow. "What is it?" she asked when he hung up. "The Hashimoto," he said, his voice like ice. "They know who you are. They sent me a picture." He turned the phone around. It was a photo of her, taken from across the street as she left her apartment building that morning. Beneath it was a simple, chilling message. "We found your new weakness." The final thread connecting her to her old life had just been severed. She wasn't just in his world anymore. She was a target at its center. Her life was no longer her own. It was a weapon to be used against him. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Kaido made a series of calls, his voice low and guttural, issuing orders in clipped Japanese. He was mobilizing his empire. War was coming, and she was the reason. The knowledge sat like a stone in her stomach. She was the weakness they had found, the leverage they would use to destroy him. He finally finished his calls and turned to her. The strategist was back, his eyes cold and calculating. "They have proposed a meeting. The head of the Hashimoto clan, Kenji. He wants to negotiate your return. He thinks I'm your property." The word tasted like ash. "He thinks you are my vulnerability. In his world, they are the same thing," Kaido said. "It is, of course, a trap. He intends to eliminate me and take over my territory." "What are you going to do?" "I am going to the meeting," he said simply. "But you will not be there. I have a car waiting. It will take you to a private airfield. You will be flown out of the country. You will be given a new name, a new life. You will be safe." She stared at him. It was a clean break, an escape. Everything she should have wanted. He was offering her a way out, a return to anonymity. But the thought of it left her cold. The life he described wasn't a life. It was an exile. Running and hiding for the rest of her days, always looking over her shoulder. And leaving him to walk into a trap alone. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Kaido's eyes narrowed. "This is not a negotiation." "I'm not going," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. She stood up, facing him. "You think hiding me will solve this? They'll just find another weakness. They'll hunt me down eventually. This doesn't end with me running away. I will handle Kenji."
How?
By walking into his trap and hoping for the best. An idea, reckless and desperate, began to form in her mind. An idea born from the things she'd overheard in his phone calls, the names of the people involved, the location of the meeting, a neutral ground fish market by the docks. "He's expecting you to come in with force." "He's not expecting me." Kaido stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Absolutely not. You will be nowhere near that meeting." "Listen to me," she insisted, her mind racing. You said it yourself. I'm an asset. My face isn't known to them, not really. I'm just a waitress. I speak the language. I can get inside. As what? A hostage? He scoffed.
No.
As a distraction. As an advantage. Their guard will be down around me. They'll see a woman, someone insignificant. They won't see a threat. I can be your eyes and ears before you ever walk in the door. I can create an opportunity. It was insane. It was suicidal. But it was the only thing she could think of that wasn't passive. It was a choice. An action. She would not be a damsel to be hidden away. She would not be the weakness that brought him down. He was silent for a long time, his gaze boring into her, searching for any sign of fear or hesitation. He found none. He saw only a resolve that mirrored his own. He was a man who respected strength, who valued calculated risks.
And he was looking at one now.
This is not a game, Nia, he said, his voice a low warning. If you make one mistake, you are dead. I know, she said. But if I run, I'm already dead. The war between his instinct to protect her and his tactical mind was visible on his face. In the end, the tactician won. He saw the logic in her madness. He saw the weapon she could be. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of her life. The plan was simple and elegant in its audacity. The fish market was a chaotic place of business, with dozens of buyers and sellers milling about. Nia, dressed as a translator for a legitimate seafood exporter, one secretly on Kaido's payroll, would arrive early. Her job was to observe, to identify Kenji's men, to find the sniper nests he would have undoubtedly set up, and to create a diversion at the precise moment Kaido arrived. Getting ready felt like preparing for a stage play. She was dressed in a simple, professional suit. Her hair was pulled back. She looked anonymous, unassuming. Kaido gave her a communications device, a tiny bead that fit inside her ear. You will only listen, he commanded. You do not speak. You do not react. If you are compromised, the plan is aborted. He looked at her, his eyes dark with 1,000 unspoken fears. He took her chin in his hand, his grip firm. Do exactly as I say. Do you understand? I understand, she whispered. His thumb stroked her jaw, a fleeting, desperate touch. Come back to me, Nia. It wasn't an order.
It was a plea.
The docks smelled of salt and diesel and dying fish. The market was a cacophony of shouting men, rattling carts, and the slap of wet fish on ice. Nia moved through the chaos, her heart a steady, cold drum in her chest. She kept her head down, her eyes scanning everything. She saw them immediately. Men who didn't belong. Men who stood too still, whose eyes were too watchful. She noted their positions, their weapons concealed beneath their jackets. She saw the glint of a rifle scope from a warehouse window across the way. She murmured the locations into a pin on her lapel, feeding the information to Kaido's team. Through her earpiece, she heard his voice, calm and controlled, directing his men, repositioning them to counter the ambush. She was his eyes. Then, she saw Kenji Hashimoto. He was older than Kaido, with a cruel slash of a mouth and eyes like chips of obsidian. He stood surrounded by his personal guard, waiting. Kaido's car pulled up. The moment of truth. He stepped out alone. He walked toward Kenji with a calm, unhurried stride, a king entering a rival's court. Tanaka, Kenji sneered. You came. I was not sure you had the courage. Where is the woman? She is not your concern, Kaido said, his voice dangerously soft. This was her cue. Nia took a deep breath. She walked toward a massive, precariously stacked pile of wooden fish crates, pretending to inspect them for her client. She moved with purpose, bumping into the stack as if by accident. It was enough. The top crates wobbled. Then, with a groan, the entire stack gave way, collapsing with a deafening crash, sending ice and fish scattering across the concrete. Chaos erupted. It was the diversion Kaido needed. In that split second of confusion, his men moved. Shots rang out, sharp and precise. It wasn't a wild firefight, it was a surgical strike. Kenji's men were taken down before they even knew what was happening. Nia scrambled away from the chaos, her heart in her throat. But a hand clamped down on her arm, yanking her back. It was one of Kenji's guards, one who hadn't been taken out in the initial volley. He pressed the cold barrel of a gun to her temple. "Drop your weapons, Tanaka, or she dies," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. Everything stopped. Kaido stood 20 feet away, his own gun raised. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked like he was about to lose control. But Nia was not the same woman who had served him water just a day ago. She didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She acted. She stomped her heel down, hard, on the man's instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. She slammed her head back into his nose. There was a sickening crunch. His hold broke completely. She threw herself to the ground as a single shot rang out. It wasn't from the guard. It was from Kaido. The guard collapsed, a neat, dark hole in his forehead. Silence descended on the dock, broken only by the cry of gulls and the distant hum of the city. Kaido's men were securing Kenji, who was alive but defeated. Kaido didn't look at any of them. He walked directly to her, his eyes burning with a terrifying fire. He knelt, checking her for injuries, his hands moving over her arms, her face, with a frantic urgency. He found a shallow cut on her arm from a piece of splintered wood. He looked from the cut to her face, and his expression broke. The cold, controlled crime boss was gone, and in his place was just a man who had almost lost the one thing he could not bear to lose. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, crushing her against him. His heart was hammering against his chest, a frantic, wild rhythm that matched her own. He buried his face in her hair. "You are not a weakness," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "You are a certainty." It was a vow, an oath, a claiming. Her old life was gone. It had burned away in the fire of the last 24 hours. She could never go back to being Nia the waitress. The cost of her survival, of her choice, was the woman she used to be. But as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous man she had ever met, she felt no regret, only a terrifying, exhilarating sense of coming home. They stood in the penthouse, the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. The chaos was over. The war was won. Kenji was gone, his empire absorbed into Kaido's. Kaido stood behind her as she looked out the window. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a brand on her skin. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the silence of a decision made, a path chosen. She looked at her reflection in the vast expanse of glass. She saw her own eyes, wide and dark. She saw the small bandage on her arm, a pale mark against her brown skin. She saw the woman she had become, a woman who could walk into the heart of danger and not only survive, but conquer. She didn't flinch from the reflection. She met its gaze, accepting it, claiming it as her own.
This was her life now.
And she would not run from it.